So today, we're going to talk about the ideas of supply and demand. Specifically today, we're going to be focusing more on demand than we are on supply. We'll get to supply in the next chapter just a little bit more later on. But we need to understand demand first before we get into anything with supply. So we're going to begin here by discussing the law of demand. The law of demand is the act and willingness of buying. That's just demand by itself. And we'll define the law of demand in a textbook type fashion here in a moment. But when we're thinking about demand economically, demand is anything where people are willing and able to buy. Yes? Yep. There's going to be a homework assignment on Canvas, so just check that. The notes will be posted hopefully this afternoon, so that way you can go back and listen to this or pick them up from somebody else. So demand is the act and willingness of buying. You can't just say that you have a high demand for donuts and yet you sit there and you window shop for donuts all day long, because that doesn't make any sense. There has to be an act involved there. There has to be a willingness to buy. It also means there has to be some funds available to go out and buy your donuts, or perhaps even as we look at the iPhone line right here, which is ridiculous every time that they put out a new iPhone. There's always a long line waiting to get in there and get that new iPhone. So when we look at demand defined, or the law of demand defined, a lot of times in economics we put in this phrase here where everything else being held constant, because there's always that one guy, or sometimes a girl, that says, well, Mr. Jones, hey, what about this? Or what if we include the... Yeah, I know there's lots of variables that we could throw into all these situations, and we could add in new ideas and all kinds of stuff. Yes, you are right. But we need to have a better definition than just, well, when this happens, then this, and everything else being held constant. This is generally true. The lower the price charged for a good or service, the greater the quantity people will demand. And it also works the other way as well. And we illustrated this in our donut scenario the other day, where we talked about how many donuts would you be willing to buy at different price points. And generally speaking, unless you are out of the normal circumstance, generally speaking, you are willing to buy more donuts at a lower price and less donuts at a higher cost. So the lower the price charged for a good or service, the greater the quantity people will demand, and vice versa. Now, in order for us to be able to understand this and for us to be able to visualize this, we can put it into two different fashions. First of all, we can make a demand schedule. Demand schedule is a table that shows for us here different price points and the amount of items that are going to be demanded at those price points. So I've given you an example up here on the screen that shows the demand schedule for candy bars. So at 45 cents a piece, we could say that the demand for those candy bars is 6,750 candy bars at 45 cents a piece per day. If we were to raise our price up to 50 cents, you can see demand decreases slightly down to 6,000. If we go to 70 cents, our demand dramatically gets cut, almost by 50%. By that 20% or 20 cent increase in price, we have now lost almost 50% of our demand. So we can look at it that way. Now, what is demand at 75 cents? What if we wanted to know demand at $1? Does this tell us that information? No. We might be able to make a guess in there somewhere, but it's not going to be real accurate. And so that's why we're going to look at using a demand curve to help us to get a better educated guess at those different price points. So if we wanted to plot these points in the graph, which a lot of times we will, we'll put those points here on our graph and create a demand curve, which will now allow us to be able to see a lot more information based off of what we already know from our demand schedule. Now when it's placed on the curve, we can now make better assumptions. So we could find almost any price point here and find out what the demand would be if this curve is done accurately. So I said before, we want to know what is it at $1. Well, we can say it's going to be about $27.50 is what I would say there at $1 would be our demand. If we want to know 75 cents, we're going to look here. I would say about $32.50, pretty close to that. Okay, and we can get more detailed with this the more information we have. But this is a demand curve. A couple things you need to know about a demand curve, especially when we begin combining this with supply. Demand curves, excuse me, demand curves will always move down and to the right. Demand curves will always move down and to the right. So when you're trying to determine, is it a demand curve, is it a supply curve, that is one of your rules of thumb to be able to help you identify whether it is demand or whether it is supply. When you are looking at these curves, or if you are asked to graph them, a couple things that we need to do for consistency. Our price always goes on the vertical axis here. And I don't know if they teach you this in math class, but I'm pretty sure they do because I know most of your math teachers really well. So, especially one of them. You need a label on here. So I should be able to tell if you are asked to graph here, you need to label that this is your price. Oftentimes you can just put a P up here for price and down here a Q for quantity. So I want to know what is the price, what is the quantity, and label them this way. Quantity always goes on the horizontal axis on there. Okay? So when we're putting that together, when you're reading that, that should be your assumption, unless the graph that you get is labeled specifically in another way. Sometimes they vary things where it's not necessarily price. Sometimes it's man hours versus quantity. So look at your labels here on the graph. Price always goes on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal. And again, make sure it's labeled well enough so that we can identify that. So if we were to look at this and now begin to understand change in quantity demanded. When you see this phrase, or when you understand that we could look at any point along this line and we could identify change in quantity demanded. When you this term right here does not move the curve at all. It is a movement along the same line on the curve. So you stay on this curve. We do not jump to other curves because we will see this where we start adding more curves in here. So a change in quantity demanded stays along the exact same curve that you are on right here. So what this means is that when we change the price of our item, it is going to change the quantity demanded. So we're dealing with candy bars right here. And we began here. We said, well, we're at 75 cents. Quantity demanded here is 3,500 candy bars. If we change the price for a candy bar and we raise it up to $1.25, that is going to reduce our quantity. So that's this concept here. Change in quantity demanded is affected by price. So anything that's affected by price stays on that same curve. Everybody with me? Cool. Now let's do a little graphing here. Here's your demand schedule. So we're going to graph the demand here for milk. Of course, you can't have donuts without milk or coffee. Maybe I should change this to coffee next year. But we're going to use milk for this particular example. So you can see in the demand schedule the quantity demanded for each price. And if I were you, I would take some notes on this or graph this into your notes and make sure that you know how this works. So we're going to put in our axis here. We're going to label the vertical axis with price, and our horizontal is going to be the quantity of milk that is going to be demanded there. So when we put that together, there's no laws about what numbers you have to include in here. You can skip some if that is what you want to do to make it simpler. Same thing here. I counted by tens. There's no law that says you have to count by tens. You can do it by individual numbers. You can do it by 20s. But the more detail that you can provide, the more accurate answer that you're going to end up with. So if we're going to plot these points in the graph, we're going to put each one up there. And if you are drawing this along with me, I would draw this nice and big so that way you've got plenty of information or plenty of room to be able to add this into your notes for good practice. So we're going to start here. We're going to put a plot up there at $5 at the 10 mark right up here. We're going to take the next price point at $4, and we're going to put another line or another dot up there by the 20 gallons of milk. We're going to continue on plotting each one of these points, $3 at 30, $2, we're going to have 50 gallons of milk demanded, and at $1, we're going to have 80 gallons of milk demanded, and then we just connect the dots. Okay, that's how we plot a demand curve. So once again, for many of you, you're doing stuff like this in math pretty regularly. Should not be hard, but we need to be able to interpret it in economics and be able to also translate that into answering questions off of this information. Okay, so any questions up to this point? How we get here, what we need to do to find this information? Cool. So let's do a little review. Take out a sheet of paper. On your sheet of paper, I want you to answer the following questions. I want you to have the sheet of paper separate from your notes or close up your notes for this particular set of questions here.